Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Cackle. The Cackle is where we meet with Midwest changemakers and connect the dots between economic trends and the lived experiences of people navigating them. I'm Emily Heinz, the founder and managing director of Entry Point. And at Entry Point, we partner with organizations to deliver comprehensive research insights and implement effective data-driven programs that really promote entrepreneurship across the Midwest. So if you're looking for an insider's take on the opportunities and challenges facing today's most inspiring change makers, you'll definitely want to join today's conversation. And if you want to see any of our research, you can download all of our research on entrypointmi.com. And if this is your first time joining us, you're welcome to the Cackle. And if you're a repeat cackler, then we're glad to have you back. And today with me, I am so pumped, is Alisyn Malek. Oh, Lord, I already messed it up. Alisyn Malek, the executive director at the Commission for the Future, Commission on the Future of Mobility. And she's also the founder and CEO of Middle Third. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here today.
I know, I'm like mid-pandemic. I haven't seen you in like a year and a half. And then prior to that, I was like just seeing you in the news all over the place. So I'm like so excited to catch up on all of the things that are going on. So if you guys all don't know Alisyn as well as I do, she's like the biggest badass in the entire mobility industry, I think. And she was at May Mobility. She has been at GM Ventures. GM prior to that, you were an engineer. You've been an investor. You've been on the operating side. So talk a little bit, just so people can get to know you a little bit about like kind of your entrepreneurial journey from like engineer to founder.
Yeah, so I'm Midwest born and raised by an entrepreneur. So I think I kind of came at my career with a level of comfort for just like figure it out, do it yourself. Lucked out. It was 2008 when I graduated from undergrad, managed to get a job at GM, which was good. It was not an easy time.
Yeah.
It was a really cool job working on electric vehicles. So I worked in EV charging and stuff like that. Really enjoyed doing things we didn't know how to do. So I started to use that as an arc of the career. That opened me up for opportunities to look at GM Ventures. And I saw that as a way to go kind of deeper into things we didn't know how to do in the auto industry and helping bridge that gap between startups and the auto industry. And from Ventures, I worked a lot on electric vehicles, autonomous vehicle technology, connected vehicle technology. So that's like having data connected to your car and stuff like that. And in that, put together the relationship between GM and Cruise Automation, which was became one of GM's biggest acquisitions, I think, ever. And then started looking at how they could bring the technology to market. Kind of disagreed with the big company approach. I worked with a professor from the University of Michigan to spin out his IP and co-found May Mobility, and helped grow May Mobility from that lab spin out to operations in 3 states across 4 cities, which was a great experience. And then sort of was looking at how do I want my career to continue. And at the end of 2019, I had a lot of experiences working with different parts of policy, from vehicle safety and emissions to then the work with May Mobility, looking at transit funding in the US, and was just like, this doesn't work. Like, it doesn't actually give us access to the way that we need to get around or get things to us.
Yeah.
And so I was like, what can I do? You know, Uber and Lyft were IPOing, and the auto industry was trying to figure out what the heck it was going to do with EVs and AVs. So I was like, what can I do to step back with all these experiences that I've had and try to push the whole industry forward in a way that's actually helpful for people, and not just creating more congestion and air pollution. And that is what led me to the Commission on the Future of Mobility. So I'm the executive director there now, and we're working on essentially breaking down policy silos globally in the transportation and mobility space. So looking at both the movement of people and the movement of goods, and how do we create a better framework for companies and the public sector, so governments and transit agencies, to collaborate and make sure that we can all get better access to the things that we need. So yeah, that's what I'm up to. And then I also have Middle Third, which is my own consulting outfit to try to continue to help other startups, other companies as they try to understand the space as well.
That's cool. I love that I feel like that's, well, in my opinion, that's like what makes like the best like advocates for the people in the ecosystem is the actual people in that ecosystem, in that community. Like kind of you've been like on the investor side and on the operating side and can really talk to like the legislature and like a lot of other stakeholders about like what's really going on in that community and how like policy can help. So I just love a thing like that.
It's funny, people didn't tell me I'm wrong as much either. I think because I've done it. So like, it's funny talking with other companies that haven't worked in the autonomous space and they're like, oh, policy needs to do this or that. I'm like, I ran an AV company. So like, here's what's up. So that's fun too.
Yeah, for real. Tell a little bit about what May Mobility is, just so people kind of know.
Yeah, so May Mobility is a company that focuses on sort of community-based, connected, electric, autonomous, and shared transportation. So they work to sort of fill first mile, last mile needs, which is where maybe you need to get from parking to where you're actually going, or you need to get from a bus stop to your end destination. They kind of fill in those gaps using autonomous vehicles.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I guess I didn't even really know that, like that's the last portion. But and then how is your experience leading a tech company through all of the challenges of scaling and all of that? Like, especially it's like kind of such a male dominated industry. I don't think you often find, like, I don't want you to have to speak on all of women's issues or anything like that, but like, it's just kind of like, I think you've had kind of a unique journey in that.
Yeah, so having been a female engineer, I was sort of used to being, one of 10. And then going into venture, it was pretty interesting because there's still not a lot of female representation, even though there's like tons of women graduating with MBA. So the pipeline is much bigger than there are for engineers. So that was interesting to see. And then going into the entrepreneurial space, I was one of the only female leaders in the autonomous space. Which kind of coming from the background didn't bother me, but it definitely helped me to appreciate that, like, I should be out talking about it, because the more just different types of people there are visible working in spaces, the more it makes it sort of an option and an idea for other people to enter. So that was always very important to me. It was interesting, like working with VCs and stuff. Because I had a male co-founder, I think we didn't have quite the same types of issues that you might have if it was a female-only team. But we definitely had the like Midwest issues of like, oh, but can you figure out how to scale and can you get talent, that were just a misunderstanding of the ecosystem as opposed to like a real problem.
Yeah.
And so that was a pretty interesting experience. And I think even within, when you're growing a company that quickly, we went from like 10 people to 30 people to like 80 people on an annualized basis, like growing quite quickly. Another big part is just internally, really, it ends up being a huge focus to create a good, healthy culture that welcomes different types of people. And that was something that, I had good partnership with my co-founders on working on, but was, I think, for all of us, a little bit surprising that was a lot of the really important work that we as leaders needed to do, was just like thinking about how we did our work to make sure everybody on the same page, kind of rowing in the same direction.
Yeah, that is really interesting. How did your view, I didn't write this question down, so I'm kind of putting you on the spot, but how did your view of like your leadership role in the company change as you guys scaled from, I was just texting with someone about this the other day that has a big company, and I was like, man, I have a small company, And like sometimes things are like challenging and like you run into obstacles and things like that. I'm like, how do you do that at like a large company? And so he was kind of like talking about like just the role of a leader. Like, how do you feel like your role as a leader changed?
Oh, drastically. When we started, I was the only person working in anything to do with business. So I was sales, I was marketing, I was customer support, I was operations. And so at the start, there was just a lot of going and doing, like I did the thing. And then as we started to scale, it was hiring out the team to start to hand off those tasks. And by the time I left, we had a marketing team, we had small but existed. We had people working on sales, customer success, and operations. So then it kind of became, how do we keep these teams working in strong orchestration? And how do we keep everybody feeling engaged? So there was still like some of the things that I would do versus like guide and coach. I handled a lot of the fundraising. So there was a lot like negotiations and red lines and that stuff, like I was doing it versus like working with our operations team on trying to think like, okay, what parts of what we do don't scale. So it was always this idea of like, all right, we've got 1. What's going to break when we go to 2? What's going to break when we go to 5? What's going to different sites? What's going to break when we go to 10 sites? Or we've got 5 sites with 100 cars, trying to get our teams to be thinking about sort of what comes next. And so with that, leadership evolves into sort of setting a vision of where we're headed and then guiding the team and helping them feel emotionally bought into like how they can help get there.
How do you feel like it's kind of like an abrupt shift when you go from an organization where your like goal is to like scale the company into like a large mobility solution to like what you're doing now with advocating for the community, where the goal isn't necessarily scale the company? It's like, yeah, you want to broaden the message and like make sure you're like educating the most people possible, but like it was that kind of like a huge shift for you? Or
it's definitely like on a day-to-day basis, like different kinds of work. But like I had a delightful mission, vision, value session with my 2 leaders last week. And like some of the stuff that I learned while I was learned poorly while we were at GM, because they kind of tried to redo some of that, and then got to actively, lead with my co-founders at May Mobility, getting to reuse some of those skills as, because we are going to grow a small policy team and we'll be growing over time. So it's nice to be able to put those foundations in place. But a lot more of our work now is how do we partner and try to create an advocacy network. So it's not like we're never going to have like 100 people. So that part's a little bit different, but at the same time, like you still have to have that clear mission and vision of who you're going to be in the world. So that way people know they can come partner with you versus like work for you. So there's parts of it that feel similar, but like my day-to-day job is more active in doing and taking the phone calls, following up with foundations and stuff versus having people, orchestrating people to do those things, which is fine. I don't mind it. Like I run an artist collective on the side, rental property, like it's just part of like day-to-day work. So it doesn't bother me. I think for people making that shift from like giant corporation to little startup that grew bigger to like little thing might be more of an adjustment, but.
You have a couple businesses on the side, you just said? Yeah. So how many hours are in your day? No, I'm just kidding. I'm like, oh my gosh.
The artist collective, like back when I was young, so I could stay up late and had capacity. If I tried to start that now, I don't think I'd be able to get it off the ground. But that's more stable, so it doesn't take as much time.
Oh, that's so cool. I like that. I never knew that. So explain what the mobility industry is for people who are like, mobility, like what is that, like with cars, or is that like helping people walk, or what?
Yeah, so mobility means different things to different people. I think if you're in the sort of transportation automotive space, it tends to mean like new technology, so scooters and Ubers and Lyfts. But ultimately, I see it as more of a people-focused word around how the heck we and our things get around. So in the policy space, lots of people talk about transportation. And that ends up translating to like roads and bridges, cars, and maybe some buses when we look at transit. And that's like a very 1950s engineering focused view of the world. And as we look at how business has evolved, and how we just as a society have evolved, like there's much more of a focus on the customer and people. So I see this shift towards mobility. Yes, there's in some spaces, there's still this like tech connotation, but this idea of just like, how do we get around? Like, even if you drive somewhere, you end up walking.
Yeah.
Parking or something. So like walking, biking, using a scooter, using a car, not traveling at all because your goods can come to you. All of that can get captured under this idea of mobility, depending, like different groups will use it a little bit differently, but that's how I capture it.
Yeah. So like what, I've been like really fascinated to see. I know like Trucks VC used to have like this annual summit that I think you would always go to. I would always sit because I knew that they called on people, and I would always be like, I do not want to talk in front of this very intimidating group of people. There was always like the heads of all the things in this like very small meeting. But I was really fascinated to hear about people talking about what is possible in the mobility space, and kind of like everyone like I think jokes about like, why don't we have flying cars already, and blah blah blah. Just like what is actually possible versus what is, you know, structured with the legislature and current policy, and what is actually going to be taken up by people, like that they'll be like, sure, I'll jump in a autonomous vehicle. So it's like we could have like Jetsons now, but people wouldn't necessarily be like comfortable just like piloting a vehicle and things. So what is like, how have things kind of changed, and like what is your view for where we're headed in the next 10 or 15 years?
So first off, mobility policy happens at different levels of government. So city versus state versus federal in the US. So there's sort of different trends at different levels. At the city level, before COVID, you saw a huge push on trying to get new tech entrants to participate in the ecosystem versus just like land and try to squash everything. Uber and Lyft, well, Uber in particular, took a very aggressive approach in the cities that they initially launched in, and not a partnership approach. So you saw cities like get much more advanced when they were working with scooter companies of like, okay, we see you. We're like getting out early.
You know, these scooters everywhere. Our neighbors would always like, we live in a slightly older community, but I'm the president of the association, and they would always email me if there was a scooter near our, like on the lawn, like near our neighborhood. They'd be like, we saw there was a scooter there. Why is it there?
So cities got out early. They tried to create sort of registrations and like setting a clear understanding of who needs to be served by the scooters and stuff like that. So at a city level, it's kind of a renaissance in what's possible, but really with this focus on how do we serve everyone and how do we make it equitable. And so that's some of the trends that you see there. Additionally, well, we'll see post this COVID package, but there were issues around budgets and transit funding that with this administration could be alleviated. At the federal level, there's a huge push in this administration to push for cleaner energy vehicles, both passenger cars, but now there's a big trend towards medium and heavy duty as well. So like big trucks, goods move, as well as buses. And that the rest of the globe has like already moved on and decided like we need, because the rest of the globe generally believes in climate change, where here it's still a bit of a debate. And so I think what's most interesting in that space right now, there's a lot of startups that are making EVs, which is exciting, but it's also a competitive issue for the nation. Automotive makes up 3% of our manufacturing GDP, and manufacturing is only 11% of the US GDP. So like if we think about with COVID and they're like, oh gosh, we need ventilators, who's gonna make them? It was the auto industry. Like, frankly, that makes no sense. Yeah. But we've outsourced so much that it was like, this is the only manufacturers we still have. And so it's just this like crazy time right now at a federal policy level of like, A, we need to transition to new energy, and B, like realizing that it is important to still make stuff in the US. So that's kind of at a federal level what's going on. And then Pete Buttigieg is the Secretary of Transportation, which transportation nerds and urban planning nerds are super excited about.
Yeah.
So the Department of Transportation covers aviation, highways, transit, sea, like all of it. And traditionally, it's been a big focus on like highway funding has been a big thing, as opposed to like, how do we look at all of this as a system? And Buttigieg's background as being a mayor gives him a little bit of a different perspective of like, what are the needs of people on the ground? So there's some hopefulness that will start to evolve in how they approach thinking through funding projects, because the federal government funds a lot of projects that happen in states. From an infrastructure perspective, there's usually an 80-20 cost share. So even at a state level, what happens at the federal level is really important, because that'll drive what budget comes through. I realized that was like a super wonky, long aside, but
no, I like that. I feel like that is just like, it's interesting how much is related, like how much of what we're seeing happen with like transit and transportation, and like the way a lot of this stuff is like mandated by this, like the government. Like it's like something you don't really realize. And then as soon as you like get into it a little bit, you're like, oh, like we could be the Jetsons, but like there's all these blockades in place to prevent that from occurring, or like any of that. So I'm like, interesting. And then like, what do you see like happening in like 10 to 15 years? Like, what do you think, if all stars aligned, where do you think you would see transportation, like all of that in like 10 to 15 years?
My secret engineer hope is that we really, from a policy and like human perspective, start thinking about it as a system. So like, if there's a bunch of traffic between, say, Detroit and Ann Arbor or Detroit and Chicago, we don't need another lane on the highway. We might actually just need a train. And that it's not like an or discussion, like it's roads or train. Like, okay, we have lots of people that need to move. What's the most efficient solution, and how do we create the most opportunity? Where right now, because like the way the laws are set up and the funding is approached, it's sort of like road first, then maybe something else. So my hope is just like that we can start to work on a more systematic approach. And it also gets really wonky, because some of this stuff, especially for being able to get access to land and things, it's actually easier to get access to land for road funding than it is for adding a rail line. So like in California, it's easier to expand a highway than it is to get rail put in. They were working on a project between San Francisco and LA, and it's just become like a complete mess, because like the way that it's set up to get the approval for land is just messy and less easy. And so stuff like that, where it's like, if we can just not necessarily have the federal government take over everything, because locals do need to be able to have a say. The highway funding that like leveled center cities was awful. But being able to have a better like collaborative discussion around what does a community need, and not just like the single townships, but a like multi-county region.
Yeah, that is. How do you see the sort of public perception changing around mobility solutions? Like, do you think like most people are like understand roads and cars and like that kind of traditional auto industry, and so that they're more likely to kind of follow what's been done? Or do you feel like people are starting to be a little bit more like holistic in the thinking of the system?
I think it depends on like who you're talking to. If we are in Michigan and talk to somebody on the street, it is like roads and cars.
Yeah.
I think policymakers, especially ones that either represent large cities and large metro areas or have that type of a background, understand that like we cannot build our way out of. We've actually known since the 50s that we can't build our way out of this with more roads, like in terms of metro areas having bad congestion, because more lanes actually there's like a psychological effect where if there's more lanes, more people will use it, which just leads to more congestion. So like that's not going to fix it, but somehow we still think that it might. So I think that stuff is starting to change. So these like fringe ideas around, let's not expand highways. Let's actually infill highways that are in cities that we built, back in the 60s. And we're like, oops, we just like leveled a whole bunch of, communities of color and like their most vibrant neighborhoods, kind of recognizing the impact that stuff has, I think is exciting as we look towards the future, that there's just more consideration of other options and how communities locally are impacted.
Yeah. And I guess along that lines, like, what do you think how does the advancement of mobility help address inequalities in low-income communities and things like that?
The advancement of like technology doesn't do it. It really requires that public part, because businesses are set up to make money. And if there's an area where they don't think that they can go in and make money, then they're not going to do it. And that's where government plays a really important role to help say, no, this area is important. We need to make sure that there's access. And we also just have to admit that, like, historically, we've kind of led ourselves to this point. So we do need to kind of come together to help undo the barriers that we created through actions like redlining, like leveling neighborhoods for highways. And I think there's enough policymakers that appreciate, like, there's some bad we need to undo to be able to participate. And they're really the ones that drive the conversation then for private providers to come in and look at how can we provide services that can be helpful.
Okay. How much of your role at the Commission on the Future of Mobility is kind of focused on helping change public perception as part of, like, build support in the public for a lot of these changes?
Yeah, so first we have to pick what we're going to focus on. So I'm working with my team right now. I'm like, okay, here's like the specific issues we're going to target. Our approach is going to be to do data-driven advocacy. So once we pick those areas, we need to
over here.
So we gotta get the data to be able to then go advocate. But for a lot of this, I think it is going to require sort of that grassroots change of like, oh, even there's a big change in our generation of looking for a walkable community. Many, people that grew up in the 80s and 90s lived in cul-de-sac communities where you couldn't get anywhere. It was kind of boring.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people looking. I grew up in like what was the sticks? It's not really the sticks anymore. But like, I dreamed of being able to like walk somewhere. I'd go to where my dad grew up, which is a tiny farming town, but my grandma lived in town, so I could like walk to the 5 and Dime and buy my own candy, and like that was revolutionary. So I think that is a shift in public perception that I think is a generational shift, which is exciting to see. So I think those types of shifts will be very powerful in changing policy. So we will, as it makes sense for the different focus areas, kind of pick ones where we think a grassroots action could be the most effective way to drive change.
That totally reminded me of like when you're a kid and you can only get to like one place on your bike or whatever. Like I could get to a Bates. Have you ever been to a Bates? And they have the most tasty fries and greasiest burgers. They're so good. Quick commercial for Bates. Well, it's what's on the horizon for you. We have like 1 minute left here, so.
We're working on what our focus areas are going to be, and then I'll be out growing the team and doing more advocacy. So super, super excited about it, and to be able to help change the world.
Yay! I love it. Changing the world is on the horizon. I love that. So cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm like so happy to catch up and see everything you're working on. And I will definitely be like keeping my eyes peeled for like what all you guys are doing and things, because I'm such like a mobility and Alisyn fangirl. But yeah, thank you so much.
Good to see you. Thank you. It's good. I agree. It was good to catch up.
Yay. Okay. And we will see everyone next Wednesday. And who are we talking to next Wednesday? Oh my gosh, why am I forgetting? So Oh, we're talking to Mark Howland, who is starting Breadless, which is going to be a breadless sandwich shop. It's in Detroit, and they just raised a pretty significant round of venture funding, which is like unheard of for a food industry company. So I'm like so excited to hear about all of that. So cool. Okay, see you later.